Taehyung's live moment turned chaotic before anyone could even process what was happening. The broadcast began like most of his streams did, casual, unfiltered, a little playful, the kind where fans expected music snippets, behind-the-scenes chatter, or his low chuckle reacting to wild comments. The red light blinked on, signaling the feed was live, but the mood in the studio was already tense before his voice filled the air. No one watching from home could smell it, but the room carried a faint scent of overheated plastic and ozone from lights that had been running too long. It felt less like a broadcast studio and more like a pressure cooker built from glass and electricity. Taehyung leaned forward in his chair, elbows pressed into his thighs, eyes locked onto the camera lens like it was daring him to crack first. His jaw was set, glistening slightly with sweat, catching the glow of the unflattering studio lights. Somewhere off-camera, a producer frantically gestured for him to stay composed, mouthing a warning he never caught. All he could hear was his own heartbeat thundering like bass through his ribs. He had always worn control like armor. Discipline was part of his mythology, part of the BTS story fans admired. Late-night practice, perfectionism, relentless artistry. But tonight the armor felt heavy, dented from the inside. Jungkook stood just beyond the edge of the frame, arms folded, posture deceptively calm. He had mastered the art of looking collected even when emotions churned like a storm under the surface. His gaze moved between Taehyung and a secondary monitor where comments scrolled like a wildfire. Hearts, fire emojis, shocked reactions, wild theories forming in real time. Fans asked why the atmosphere felt different, why Taehyung looked like he was starring through the screen instead of at it, why Jungkook wasn't sitting beside him like usual. The chat was already trying to write the story for them. Taehyung spoke first, voice slicing through the hum of electronics. He said the words before thinking, the way someone blurts something they've rehearsed only in their mind. Turn it off now. The comment counter climbed instead. Viewers multiplied by the second. The crew froze. A director hovered a finger over the kill switch but hesitated, torn between protocol and spectacle. Jungkook didn't flinch. He had expected the breaking point. He had seen the signs backstage. Taehyung rubbing his palms together too often, laughing a little too sharp when nervous, spacing out during small talk like he was counting something invisible. Taehyung demanded the truth like someone demanding air. Say it, say what you told me backstage. A ripple of shock rolled through the crew. The chat detonated. Jungkook stepped forward. The camera caught him fully now, framed in harsh light that would later be memed, clipped, slowed down, dramatized. He said it softly but clearly. I won't lie for you. The words hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Taehyung laughed once, a brittle sound that never reached his eyes. Lie. You think this is about lying? He stood abruptly, chair scraping back like an exclamation mark drawn in metal. The motion jolted old memories loose. Practice rooms where every misstep echoed. Nights where sleep only came when exhaustion knocked him out first. The endless cost of being the polished version of himself. Jungkook replied without raising his voice. I look at you like that because you don't know how close you are to breaking yourself. The chat went feral. Clips were already circulating. Captions were being forged in seconds. Yunguk versus Taehyung narratives from the original draft were gone. Now it was Taehyung and Jungkook, a battle fans thought they understood. The comment section was rewriting the silence between them into coldness, boundaries into betrayal, intensity into anger. Taehyung snapped back, defensive and exposed. Don't diagnose me on live. He softened, almost imperceptibly, like someone realizing the door behind them had locked. Don't do this here. Jungkook didn't step back. He crouched slightly, meeting Taehyung at eye level without crossing the invisible line he knew better than to cross. He said it slower this time, letting every syllable land clean. This isn't a punishment designed for you. This isn't karma teaching you a lesson. This is life happening in public because the feed wouldn't die when you asked it to. Taehyung hated that framing. He hated being a headline. He hated the idea that vulnerability only counted when it went viral. But he also hated the silence that made him feel unnecessary, like an extra in a story that used to belong to both of them. The feed cut off abruptly, the red light dying like a plug yanked from the universe. The room exhaled. The air was finally ordinary again, thick with adrenaline and dread. Phones rang instantly. Managers demanded a statement. Someone whispered about a hiatus. Taehyung slid back into his seat, shaking hands betraying him. He had always thought control was love. Now he wasn't so sure. Jungkook stood, thumb pressing into the groove of a ring on his finger, grounding himself. His secret was intact for now. But the cost of truth had just begun calculating itself in the dark, behind glass, under lights that couldn't cool fast enough. The silence after the feed died was loud in a way the broadcast never was. The crew scrambled, producers whispering into headsets, managers already speed dialing, PR teams drafting statements that would never sound as raw as the moment the world had just witnessed. Taehyung stayed frozen in the chair for a long beat, long enough that Jungkook could see the shift in his posture, from explosion to collapse, from fire to ash that was still burning, just quieter. He hated how fast the narrative was being manufactured without him. He hated even more that part of him had expected it. Jungkook sat down beside him once the room cleared enough to breathe. He didn't speak at first, because the only thing worse than silence to Taehyung was a voice trying to fill it artificially. The studio lights hummed overhead, cooling fans working overtime, casting a warmth that felt ironic now. Taehyung could finally smell the dust burning off the bulbs, a gritty, familiar scent from years of late rehearsals and cramped backstage corridors. It reminded him that even the brightest moments in their careers were powered by something overheated, fragile and human. "You went there fast," Jungkook said eventually, voice low, not judgmental, not sympathetic either, just observant. Taehyung didn't bristle this time. He exhaled through his nose, jaw unclenching by degrees. "I go there when I feel like I'm losing the story," he admitted. "Like if I don't force the truth out, someone else gets to name it first." Jungkook nodded. He knew the psychology of public framing better than most. Fame didn't make them immune to misinterpretation. It just guaranteed a bigger audience for it. Taehyung rubbed his palms together, slower now, embarrassed that the habit had become so readable. "They're going to say I'm uncooperative again," he muttered, "that I can't handle pressure." Jungkook let out a humorless chuckle. "They'll say what tests best for clicks," he replied. "Conflict always outperforms nuance, but you're not uncooperative, you're overstimulated and finally talking back." Taehyung glanced at him, appreciating the distinction. In fandom ecosystems, labels were everything. One word could crown or crucify. Within minutes, clips were already trending on Twitter and TikTok, hashtags splintering into factions. Jungkook didn't look at the screen. Taehyung did, against his better judgment, watching fragments of his own voice looped into micro-judgments. His command to cut the feed was captioned as a meltdown. Jungkook's boundary line was framed as a betrayal. Context evaporated faster than water on a griddle. The machinery was doing exactly what it always did: simplifying, polarizing, assigning heroes and villains to emotions that were never binary. Taehyung finally dropped the phone onto the couch, letting it bounce once, a surrender gesture. "You think we survive this one?" he asked. Jungkook didn't answer immediately. "Survival isn't the question anymore," he said. "The question is whether we grow through it without letting them narrate our motives." That landed. Taehyung wasn't used to motives being treated as negotiable property. He was used to effort being the currency, control being the brand, intensity being the proof of devotion. Later that night, Taehyung sat in his apartment, replaying the moment in his head, not on his phone. He could hear Jungkook's voice in his memory, steady and boundary firm. He recognized the old feedback loops, the need to justify, the urge to escalate, the belief that discipline could out-engineer emotion. But live broadcasts weren't engineering rooms. They were confessional arenas, whether he consented or not. And now the world had seen a crack in the armor he had forged long before the debut lights ever warmed his face. By morning, management sent a briefing dense with optics and strategic vocabulary, recommending a controlled live address to reclaim the narrative. Taehyung didn't snarl this time. He smiled wryly at the phrasing. Reclaiming narratives was what politicians did. Artists reclaimed stages. Humans reclaimed agency. He forwarded the message to Jungkook without comment. Jungkook replied with a single line, "Don't give them another life they didn't earn." Taehyung read it twice, letting the sentence work as a permission slip for autonomy instead of a gag order. They met again in a rehearsal studio later that week, not under red lights, but under mirrors that remembered every version of them. Rookies, idols, perfectionists, boundary setters, friends who mistook intensity for intimacy for a little too long. The room smelled of old wood, dust, and time, a neutral witness. Taehyung spoke first. "I don't want to be brave on command," he repeated from their last conversation. Jungkook finished the thought. "Then we choose when to speak, and when to breathe, not when the counter climbs." Taehyung nodded, feeling the familiar storm inside him quieter, not gone, but paced. 1 hour of storytelling demanded rhythm, not overload. Viral ecosystems demanded sparks, but healing demanded pauses. And for the first time, he was starting to believe that boundaries could be a form of loyalty too, not the flashy kind that trended, but the quiet, sustainable kind that kept artists from burning themselves down to satisfy an algorithm that would never send a thank you card. The storm didn't calm down after the forum or the leaked footage, but Taehyung did. That was the quiet revolution no algorithm could detect immediately. Healing had forced him into a slower cadence, the kind that felt wrong at first because his career had always rewarded intensity, constant motion, and emotional availability delivered like a concert encore. But now, he was learning a new rhythm, one that didn't mistake noise for impact. The fandom, of course, was still trying to decode every breath, every blink, every moment Jungkook wasn't standing close enough to be photographed. Jungkook, on the other hand, was fighting a parallel war, one of privacy, nuance, and media projection. He had always been composed in public, not because he lacked turbulence, but because he understood the physics of it. The world treated calm men as architects and emotional men as disasters waiting to be narrated. He knew that if he reacted loudly, he would validate a story that wasn't theirs. So he chose restraint. Restraint wasn't silence. It was authorship deferred until the right moment. Taehyung noticed the toll anyway. It was in the micro-movements, Jungkook checking schedules twice, tightening his jaw when staff mentioned anniversaries or comeback appearances, the way his foot tapped softly when he thought no one was watching. Taehyung had once misread those signals as emotional distance. Now, he read them as fatigue. The kind you earn when you've spent years holding the door shut against a hurricane that keeps trying to borrow your voice. They resumed rehearsals because management believed in forward momentum even when emotions begged for punctuation. The practice room felt like a sanctuary compared to the press rooms, but even sanctuaries have acoustics. A dancer missed a cue. A stylist misfiled a wardrobe request. Small mistakes, but Taehyung felt the familiar pressure tighten behind his sternum. His breath sharpened. His tongue braced itself for a snap. He caught Jungkook's eye in the mirror. Jungkook raised 2 fingers. Pause. The signal they had agreed on, a semaphore flag for emotional triage. Taehyung stopped, the wave breaking against a seawall built from agreement rather than discipline. "I'm sorry," he said, voice rough but controlled enough to land cleanly. The dancer blinked, surprised that the apology came without theatrics. The room exhaled collectively. Not a viral moment, not a cinematic line, just a boundary of decency re-established in real time. Jungkook didn't nod approvingly. He nodded respectfully. Respect was quieter than approval, but heavier in the long term. That night Taehyung wrote lyrics that scared him in their simplicity. No metaphors about detonators or red lights. No armor forged from syllables. Just honesty delivered like a human heartbeat, irregular, sincere, alive. He sent the demo to Jungkook first, because for all the world's noise he trusted one audience more than millions. Jungkook listened in silence, eyes closed, posture still. He didn't interrupt the track once. When he opened his eyes, they were glassy in a way that felt earned, not rehearsed. "This is you," Jungkook said. "Not viral you, not crisis you, just you without translation." Taehyung felt something unclench in his chest. He had feared that stripping the spectacle would strip the significance. It didn't. It just changed the audience from millions who assumed to a handful who listened. The song released weeks later. Reactions were split because the internet can't resist a binary. Some called it courageous. Others called it calculated. The analysis itself proved that no one was listening to the actual cadence of the words. Taehyung didn't check the metrics. Jungkook didn't trend jump. They sat on a balcony again, unfamiliar city lights scattering across their faces like confetti the world hadn't planned. The world didn't need to plan their breathing for it to matter anymore. "I don't think I'm afraid of losing control again," Taehyung said quietly. Jungkook smirked faintly. "That's new," Taehyung corrected himself. "I'm afraid of losing myself, not control, and those aren't the same thing." Jungkook nodded slowly. "I think I'm afraid of being needed more than being loved." Taehyung reached for his hand. No demand, no timeline, no live counter climbing. Just presence delivered like an answer that didn't need subtitles. For once, their silence didn't sound like suspense. It sounded like a boundary, a promise, and a small truce signed without witnesses. The viral machine would never stop asking for performances, reactions, narratives, collapses, or comebacks. But humans didn't owe algorithms their raw nerve endings. Artists didn't owe fans a breakdown they couldn't metabolize. And Taehyung and Jungkook were finally learning that loyalty could survive honesty, and honesty could survive boundaries, as long as neither of them tried to feed the process into a detonator again. The world outside continued its unrelenting pace, indifferent to the quiet victories Taehyung had carved out in private. The internet churned with clips, rumors, and speculation, but the rehearsal room became a different kind of stage. Here, mistakes were learning moments, pauses were allowed, and intensity didn't have to masquerade as perfection. Taehyung found himself breathing slower, letting the music guide him instead of forcing himself into preordained gestures for the cameras. Jungkook was always there, a steady presence, neither hovering nor absent, signaling when to stop, when to continue, when to simply exist in a shared space without performance. One evening, after an exhaustive rehearsal, Taehyung collapsed onto the studio floor, sweat cooling on his skin. Jungkook crouched beside him, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. "You okay?" he asked softly, tone precise but kind. Taehyung exhaled sharply, a laugh breaking out despite the tension still lingering in his chest. "I didn't explode," he said, voice hoarse. Jungkook smiled faintly. "I noticed," he replied. Relief and dread intermingled in Taehyung's chest. Relief for surviving the rehearsal intact, dread for what the world might still demand next. Days blended into nights. The anniversary of the live incident approached like a phantom Taehyung couldn't quite outrun. Management began nudging him toward a live statement, a reclamation of narrative, but the very thought made his stomach coil. He couldn't perform honesty on someone else's terms, not anymore. Jungkook understood instinctively, and their conversations were precise, urgent, but grounded. "You don't have to stay if it costs you too much," Taehyung said one night, testing both the water and himself. Jungkook met his gaze, unwavering. "Is that what you want?" he asked. The question was soft, but the weight behind it pinned Taehyung in place. Taehyung realized then that wanting wasn't a weakness. It was a declaration of intention. The forum they attended days later reinforced that lesson. It was polished, glass-walled, sterile, but Jungkook's presence reminded him that the optics weren't the only reality. He stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, and felt a familiar surge, the instinct to perform, to dominate, to convince. He anchored himself with Jungkook's calm from the front row. He could hear the whispers, the calculations, the polite curiosity. Yet this time the red light was metaphorical, not literal. No live stream counter ticking upward. No detonator waiting to explode. Just him, his words, and the choice to speak them honestly. "I'm not here to apologize for being human," Taehyung began, steadying himself as murmurs softened. "I'm here to speak truthfully about the experience, not to perform recovery for your comfort." The words landed like stones in calm water, ripples stretching across rows of attentive faces. He spoke of fear, anger, vulnerability, not dramatized, not weaponized, just lived. Questions came sharp and fast, probing the depth of the fallout, the truth of the absences, the stability of his mind. Taehyung answered, measured, with restraint that didn't sacrifice authenticity. "I regret not asking for help sooner," he admitted. "I don't regret being honest when it got messy." When the session ended, the applause was polite, restrained. He didn't bow. He simply walked off the stage, chest rising and falling, heart still thrumming. Jungkook caught up immediately, checking the cadence of Taehyung's breathing. "You set boundaries," Jungkook observed quietly. "That's more dangerous than what you think," Taehyung replied with a faint smile. "Dangerous because it wasn't a spectacle, because it couldn't be clipped into a thumbnail, because it defied the world's instinct to sensationalize." The next days were a battleground of subtle pressures. Executives spoke in polished tones about optics, hiatuses framed as care, and narratives waiting to be recast. Taehyung listened, letting the words wash over him without internalizing their accusations. Jungkook remained a sentinel beside him, silent but vigilant. One night, after another barrage of calls and emails, Taehyung collapsed onto his apartment couch. Jungkook arrived, carrying a bag of takeout neither of them would eat much of, just a gesture of presence. They sat shoulder to shoulder, breathing, absorbing the city's pulse together. "You ever resent me?" Taehyung asked quietly, voice tentative. Jungkook didn't answer immediately. "Sometimes," he said finally. "When you scare me, when you make yourself smaller to survive." Taehyung absorbed the confession, letting it settle into the quiet space between them. "And do you ever feel like leaving?" he pressed. "Sometimes, when staying feels like setting myself on fire," Jungkook admitted. The honesty cut deep, but it healed simultaneously. "Then why don't you?" Taehyung asked softly. "Because we're learning," Jungkook said. "And love isn't supposed to be easy, but it shouldn't be impossible either." Taehyung let the words settle. For the first time, he realized that viral chaos, public misinterpretation, and internal storms weren't the same as failure. The measure of their bond wasn't likes or comments or trending hashtags. It was the fragile, imperfect, courageous act of staying, of choosing each other despite the noise. Weeks passed and small victories accrued quietly. Rehearsals became predictable again, not from routine but from mutual understanding. They navigated boundaries, missteps, and triggers with signals, gestures, and sometimes gentle verbal interventions. The world would still dissect and sensationalize, but they weren't feeding it. They were learning the difference between survival and spectacle. In private, music flourished again. Lyrics bled truth without performance, and melodies carried restraint as much as emotion. Finally, the anniversary of the live incident arrived. Taehyung suggested returning to the studio where it all began. Standing in front of the mirrors, he faced both reflection and memory. "I thought this place would haunt me," he admitted. "It did," Jungkook replied simply. But the haunting was different now, not a red light blinking, not a counter ticking. Just history, acknowledged and reframed. "I don't want to be fearless," Taehyung said, eyes steady. "I want to be honest," Jungkook smiled. "That's braver." Outside, sunlight fell ordinary and vast. No cameras, no headlines, no expectation of performance. Just them carrying their truths forward, imperfectly, humanly, quietly victorious. Days rolled into each other like waves, relentless but predictable. Taehyung found himself navigating the same city streets, studios, and apartment corridors with a new awareness. The viral storm had cooled slightly, but the undercurrents remained. Every message, every call, every glance carried the weight of scrutiny. He noticed it, but it no longer dictated his every move. Jungkook's presence was a buffer, a quiet constant that reminded him he could exist beyond the gaze of the public. One afternoon, the duo returned to the studio for a casual rehearsal, the mirrors reflecting the patterns of their movements. Music flowed differently now, not a performance aimed at validation, but a conversation between them, a dialogue of rhythm and emotion. Taehyung stopped mid-step, letting his eyes linger on Jungkook's calm focus. "You make this feel possible," he said softly. Jungkook glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not easy," he replied, "but worth it." The anniversary of the live incident hovered like a shadow. Management suggested a formal statement, a live address to reclaim control over the narrative. Taehyung hesitated, fingers tracing the edge of a music sheet. "They want me to speak," he murmured. Jungkook, reading the subtle tension, placed a hand over his. "Only if you choose it," he said. That phrase anchored him. For the first time, he felt agency in a world that constantly tried to dictate his words, his tone, his actions. That evening they walked to a small, quiet cafe, hidden from prying eyes. Steam rose from their cups, a gentle rhythm against the city's pulse. Taehyung exhaled, allowing the fatigue and tension to slip off him. "I almost let it control me," he admitted. Jungkook nodded. "It's tempting," he said, "but you survived the first storm. You can survive the next." The reassurance was subtle, but it carried weight deeper than any headline could capture. Rehearsals continued with small victories. Taehyung began to identify triggers without judgment. If a scene felt overwhelming, he signaled Jungkook with a discreet gesture. If emotions threatened to spill, they paused, reset, and resumed with clarity. It wasn't perfection. It wasn't seamless. It was real. Each session ended with exhaustion tempered by accomplishment. Late nights became a space for reflection. Taehyung often sat by his window, city lights scattering across the streets below. Messages, social media mentions, and notifications hummed in the background, but they were secondary. Jungkook joined him, leaning lightly against the sill. Silence became their language. Sometimes words were unnecessary, presence was enough. The anniversary post approached. Taehyung had drafted it carefully, choosing words that conveyed accountability, honesty, and humanity. He didn't apologize for being human. He didn't weaponize his experience for sympathy. He simply spoke. Jungkook reviewed the draft, offering subtle guidance, a nudge here, a caution there. The final message went live in the early hours, and Taehyung powered down his phone, resisting the compulsion to monitor reactions. The response was immediate, polarized, but irrelevant to the calm Taehyung now felt. He didn't seek validation, only honesty. Jungkook sat beside him, silent, sharing a moment removed from spectacle. They ate minimally and let the city hum around them. The outside world had no dominion over the quiet victories they had crafted in private. Weeks passed. New projects arrived, new pressures mounted, but Taehyung navigated them with a resilience born from hard-earned lessons. He still stumbled, still confronted panic, but he did so with a framework of trust, boundaries, and support. Jungkook remained constant, not a shield, not a manager, but a partner in shared existence. Their interactions carried depth, patience, and unspoken acknowledgement of fragility. One night, returning from a late rehearsal, Taehyung noticed a leak. Old footage of the live incident resurfaced, unedited. Panic crept in, familiar and unwelcome. He froze mid-step, phone trembling in his hand. Jungkook leaned over, reading the screen, expression sharp. "They get context," Taehyung said, voice tight. Jungkook's response was measured. "They get ammunition," he said quietly. The words settled heavily. Reality was unchanged. Public scrutiny was relentless, but it no longer dictated his inner life. The footage circulated within an hour. Comments dissected, romanticized, criticized, and diagnosed. Taehyung's body tensed, instinct urging control, but his mind remembered Jungkook's grounding. "They're turning it into entertainment," he whispered. "They always do," Jungkook replied. "The difference is whether you let it define you." Taehyung exhaled, letting go of the compulsion to respond, to justify, to perform. Therapy continued. It was grueling, honest, and raw. He sat in quiet rooms, confronting fear, frustration, and anger without dramatization. Jungkook waited outside, never intruding, never judging. Some sessions left him silent, others trembling, one particularly furious. Each session chipped away at the pretense, leaving fragments of self-knowledge. He learned to distinguish between discipline and health, control and authenticity. Management pushed for narrative reclamation, a glossy appearance meant to reassure stakeholders. Taehyung stood firm, refusing to perform scripted honesty. He would speak his truth, not theirs. Jungkook's presence was both shield and anchor, a reminder that he could navigate this world without sacrificing himself. The days grew heavier as another documentary announcement surfaced, promising context but inevitably seeking spectacle. Old clips resurfaced, narratives twisted anew. Public opinion surged like a tide, threatening to pull him under. Yet Taehyung's response was measured, grounded, restrained. He relied on the rhythms of rehearsal, the quiet signals from Jungkook, and the lessons of self-trust cultivated over weeks. Even in moments of fear and doubt, he remembered their shared rules: presence, honesty, and boundaries. Arguments flared, voices rose, but reconciliation followed. Healing was not linear, but each break no longer felt like an ending. It was a pause, an opening, a chance to recalibrate. Their bond deepened not through perfection, but through endurance and choice. Returning to the studio where the live incident had begun, Taehyung observed the mirrors. "I thought this place would haunt me," he admitted. Jungkook responded simply, "For a while." Taehyung faced himself in reflection, not just the cracks but the seams holding him together. "I don't want to be fearless," he said. "I want to be honest." Jungkook smiled. "That's braver." They left the studio together, stepping into ordinary daylight, carrying truths that were neither weapons nor shields, but companions through a world that demanded spectacle yet offered little understanding. The next morning the city hummed with indifference, unaware of the private victories shaping Taehyung's world. He woke early, light filtering through the curtains, feeling the residue of yesterday's calm. Jungkook was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the couch, a cup of tea warming his hands. The silence between them was familiar, comforting, a space where neither needed to perform. Taehyung rose slowly, stretching the tension from his shoulders. He traced a hand along the edge of the table, feeling the weight of choices made and the freedom earned. "Another day," he murmured. Jungkook glanced at him. "Another wave," he replied, voice steady. The metaphor wasn't lost on Taehyung. The waves were inevitable, but now he had learned how to ride them rather than be swallowed. Rehearsals that week were charged but different. Music no longer demanded perfection. It demanded presence. Taehyung found himself letting go of microcontrol, trusting the rhythm, the space, and most importantly, Jungkook. When emotions flared, a subtle glance or a hand gesture reminded him to breathe, to pause, to reset. Each pause became a lesson in resilience. Later, they faced a media opportunity, a closed-door interview with industry leaders. The briefing was clear: control the narrative, protect the brand, minimize risk. Taehyung felt the familiar constriction in his chest, the instinctive panic at the idea of performing honesty as spectacle. Jungkook noticed immediately, sliding a hand to his shoulder. "Choose your words, not their timing," he whispered. The advice anchored him. The interview began. Taehyung spoke calmly, deliberately, answering questions with precision while remaining authentic. He acknowledged the live incident without dramatization, framing it as a moment of human vulnerability, not a spectacle. Jungkook sat beside him, silent, present, his presence more impactful than any scripted support ever could be. Questions about his mental state arose, sharp and probing. Taehyung's fingers curled around the edge of the chair, a subtle grounding technique he had learned in therapy. "I've been managing symptoms, not just appearances," he said, voice steady. "The experience taught me to recognize and navigate my triggers, not ignore them. That's the journey I'm on, human, imperfect, and learning." The room shifted. Industry leaders murmured, intrigued by the balance of honesty and poise. Afterward, they walked together, city lights spilling over empty streets. Taehyung exhaled, letting the tension drain. "I didn't collapse," he said, voice laced with quiet pride. Jungkook smiled faintly. "You didn't just survive, you reclaimed yourself." The words resonated deeper than any praise ever had. Back at their apartment, notifications buzzed relentlessly. Clips from the interview circulated, dissected, praised, criticized. Taehyung let the phone lie untouched. The world could roar. It no longer controlled him. Jungkook observed silently, leaning back with a measured patience that reminded Taehyung to breathe, to exist in the present rather than chase external validation. Days blurred into weeks. Rehearsals, interviews, therapy, and quiet moments at home defined a rhythm of resilience. Taehyung discovered the power of presence over performance. Each argument with Jungkook, each difference of opinion, became a lesson in negotiation, trust, and understanding rather than conflict. They learned to hold space for one another, even when fear and frustration bubbled to the surface. One evening, the anniversary of the live incident arrived again. Management suggested a public acknowledgement, a brief statement, a controlled narrative. Taehyung refused. "I will speak when I'm ready in my own words," he declared. Jungkook nodded, understanding without judgment. Together, they planned a private rehearsal of the statement, refining tone, packing, and intent. The goal wasn't spectacle, it was integrity. That night, Taehyung wrote his thoughts, raw and unfiltered. He didn't craft a persona, he spoke as himself. He detailed fear, pressure, and lessons learned, acknowledging vulnerability without inviting judgment. He sent the draft to Jungkook first. Moments later, the reply came, "This is you, the real you." Relief flooded him, a quiet triumph deeper than applause or likes. Weeks later, a leaked clip from an old rehearsal resurfaced online. Panic sparked instantly, the reflexive instinct to control threatening to overwhelm him. Jungkook noticed immediately. "Pause," he said, holding out his hand. "Breathe. Presence first." Taehyung closed his eyes, inhaled, and allowed himself to feel without reacting. The moment passed, leaving clarity in its wake. Healing was not linear. Setbacks appeared, triggered by past habits, expectations, or sudden news. Taehyung faced each moment with measured awareness, using tools learned in therapy and the silent support of Jungkook. Arguments flared occasionally, hot, loud, raw, but reconciliation was faster, deeper, grounded in the trust built through shared vulnerability. One particularly difficult day, old footage of the live incident resurfaced alongside commentary framing him as volatile. Taehyung's chest tightened, fingers gripping the edge of a table. Jungkook placed a steadying hand over his. "They can't define you," he said softly. "Only you define yourself. Only you choose how to respond." The reassurance grounded Taehyung, reminding him of lessons learned. He could survive scrutiny without succumbing to it. Nightfall brought quiet reflection. Taehyung stood by the window, city lights flickering below. Jungkook joined him, leaning casually, offering presence without intrusion. They spoke little, the silence carried more meaning than words ever could. Eventually, Taehyung voiced the unspoken thought. "I'm still afraid," he admitted. Jungkook's hand found his, reassuringly light. "So am I, but we navigate it together." The days continued in this rhythm. Rehearsal, reflection, therapy, presence, and trust. Taehyung grew comfortable acknowledging vulnerability without fear, confronting triggers without panic. He learned that control was not the absence of chaos, but the ability to navigate it with support, honesty, and resilience.